next item on our agenda, which is my colleague Winston Thomas. He's going to be hosting the Fireside chat on the subject of playing digital catch-up, what CDOs must do now. And Winston's going to be joined by a distinguished panel of three: Terry Crawford-Smith, Vice President for Sales for APAC for Conga; Abhishek Rathi, the Vice President and Head of Digital APAC, Prudential Financial; and Pedro Sousa Cardoso, the Global Head of Digital Commerce at the Standard Chartered Bank. Winston, over to you.
Thank you, Lachlan and Darren. Thanks for the great presentation and insights. I think we have lots to talk about, and it's interesting to see the questions coming up. But this is a fireside chat, so I'll just dive into the topic itself, and then we'll move on to the questions. Again, I will encourage people to make this fireside chat your fireside chat. We have three people coming from different areas, as well as an expertise as from solution providers, as well as customers, users themselves. So it'll be really great to get your questions answered through them. But before that, just let me tell you, the topic today we're going to be talking about is playing digital catch-up, what CDOs must do now. And it was interesting in Darren's presentation that we had this poll about where we are in the digital journey. And it's good to see that a lot of you seem to have said that we are already in the journey. The question now is, how do we get into the journey? And when we say about digital transformation accelerating, what does that really mean to a CDO? Now, I won't be answering that, and I'll be leaving that question to my dear panelists. So maybe, Pedro, let me start with you. We have been hearing throughout the entire year that digital transformation is accelerating. From your perspective, what is accelerating? Is it digital initiatives that has been put and baked and that's accelerating, or are those new digital initiatives?
Thank you, Winston, and very good morning, everyone. So I would, perhaps when it comes to banking, I would probably separate this in two periods. Let's talk about 2018, 2019 as the first period, and then 2020 and now 2021 as the second period. Now, during the first period of time, 2018, 2019, I think here in Asia, we have seen in the banking industry, for instance, a number of digital banking licenses being issued. And I think it's probably fair to say that has triggered a number of initiatives by both incumbent players as well as challenger banks, right? And during the second period, which was, of course, throughout the pandemic since 2020 all the way to 2021, where we are today, I think organizations would have to adapt their strategies, their budgets, and their roadmaps to this new environment where we are. Now, in both cases, I think we have seen a clear acceleration of the digital agenda, definitely with new business models being created and new initiatives being prioritized as a way to sustain competitive advantage. Now, in our case, not only we started some digital ventures which are publicly announced, such as a digital bank in Hong Kong and other initiatives in Indonesia, here in Singapore, something that we're working on, and a few other markets. But we have also shifted the whole organization to a completely new enterprise agile operating model. Now, this came, of course, with a lot of repurposing from existing budgets to from other areas to digital transformation. So this is how we have approached these last few years, and we believe that this is here to stay. So we are, the budgets that we have today and the changes and the adjustments that we have done on our roadmaps, our budgets, and even our operating model is here to stay for years to come.
Thanks, Pedro. And Abhishek, could you add on to that from your perspective?
Yeah, first of all, good morning to everyone and my fellow panelists as well. Darren's session was great. I think it sets a context for what we're trying to discuss here. I come from insurance, and I would like to say that one-to-one communication is what insurance thrives on. And all of that was impacted just one fine day because of the pandemic. And I think in the last 10 years, what we saw the change, Darren indicated that in the last 8 months alone, we kind of saw that change. What we see is that business strategy is no longer merely leveraging digital strategy, but in many ways is reliant on it. You know, it's kind of open to new avenues, new business models, new forms of engagement and communication with customers. And in earlier years, if digitization brought more efficiency gains, in today's change scenario, it is being looked at to accelerate the revenues, bring in the new partnerships, creating the new S-curves across industries. An example that I can give from Prudential Financial is the assurance buyout that we did a couple of years ago, which was a completely new business model for us, as well as a new partnership that we created with Grab in Indonesia to offer a critical illness product. So, I mean, again, the survey validated that most CEOs are now looking at digitization not to drive efficiency gain, but actually to push revenues through. And I would say to all the CDO and the CIO colleagues, who are in the audience, that you guys need to take center stage and bring forth or accelerate your plans of digital transformation. And I would leave by saying that what's more important for businesses now is to reevaluate the purpose, right? And if I were to give an example of Prudential again, our purpose is to help the customers manage their changing financial world and be fully prepared for life. Now, what that translates into, what kind of solutions, what kind of ecosystem strategy is for the company to, try to bring forth.
Thank you, Abhishek. And I'd just like to remind all our participants, I mean, great questions, but please do use the Q&A section to ask the questions so that we can actually follow the questions. And even if you don't come to your questions, we can answer it offline. Thanks for that. But first of all, Pedro, you mentioned about strategies and how things are accelerating at your end. Is there an indication that appetites have changed? Are we ready for big bang digital projects that might fail or might be great?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, Winston. So look, I think we need to have, we certainly have two approaches to these, right? We need to address quick wins and tactical opportunities in various markets. So I should say, because we operate across 30 plus markets, at least in the retail banking and wealth management, I mean 60 markets plus when we talk about corporate banking as well. We have a diverse footprint, right? And very different capabilities from one country to another. So we have to necessarily adapt our approaches to markets and regions. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, we have been doubling down on revenue creation and the ability, our ability to generate revenues. I think to Abhishek's earlier point, which I fully agree, to doubling down on what we can do with the traffic that we have on our digital platforms. How do we monetize the engagement with customers and the interactions we have with customers in a much more effective way? And this is how we have been approaching this whole space. Now, more transformational initiatives. Of course, they have their own place, but they normally take a bit longer, right? They take a bit more time. So you cannot just rely on these large transformation programs. You need to have a little bit of both, the large transformation programs and the more tactical ones, and they go hand in hand so that you can maximize your outcomes, right?
Thank you. I'm going to bring you in, Terry. I haven't forgotten about you. From your perspective, from a solution provider's perspective, have you seen appetites change and conversation change now?
Thank you, Winston, and good morning and good afternoon, folks down under. It's great to be here. So, yes, I think leading on from what Pedro and Abhishek were outlining, we've seen appetites change in two ways. I would say you could generalize last year, a lot of that appetite to change was out of fear or perhaps necessity. This year, I think we're seeing a mixture of people embracing digitization around optimism of where they're heading from here. But of course, depending on the region and the country, as my colleagues have pointed out. But examples I would point to in terms of where we help customers really across industries. Last year, we had quite a lot of energy and focus from government necessity around digitization of processes that previously probably would have taken years to automate. You know, things in financial services, perhaps around mortgage origination and you know, mortgage settlement that previously obviously the rules and guidelines of that around that are very tight, but allowing more digitized arrangements around contracts and so on. So that's where we're seeing a lot of change. I think going forward though, customers and CDOs are looking for a structured way of looking at where to start and where to go from here, and you know, zooming in on what are the KPIs I can impact, for example, in my offering management space. You know, how do I help the legal team speed up the cycles around negotiation and contracting whilst protecting the organisation, you know, against risk, making sure we're compliant. So,
thank you, Terry. And I think I'd like to go to Abhishek. I mean, we've been talking about, and I think all our panelists have been talking about, in terms of starting digital transformation and what are the starting points. Now, a lot of the projects we are talking about are actually making sure that we are agile as well as responsive to customer needs. A lot of this got to do with data. So digital transformation, should data transformation comes first before digital transformation, or could we not boil the ocean and do it together?
You know, seems, Winston, you kept the most difficult questions for me, but let me take a stab at that, right? It is something that we dabbled with in our organization as well. I would start off by saying that every organization in today's world needs to have an enterprise-wide data strategy. And it is no longer limited to just the CIO or the CDO or the chief data officer to lead the efforts, but it requires the involvement of the entire C-suite, right? Starting with the CEO. And this realization alone is the key to making the right decisions between where to start. I would say there are 5 factors to consider while making the decisions where to start. First is data a competitive advantage for your industry and your company? Or what just is the purpose of data that you're trying to collect from customers? Second is a current data maturity level of the organization versus the aspirations that the management has. Third, I would say, is the digital investments allocated, you know, in these areas. Fourth, surprisingly not, is the access to right talent, because data alone is not about data engineers, but it is about how you harness the data through, you know, data analytics. And 5, most important, according to me, is the culture of the organization. Again, Darren spoke about it, between the linear and the lateral thinkers. I would say this by far is one of the most important ones, because you just don't want the CDO function or the CIO functions to actually leverage data. You want the entire organization to embrace how the use cases can be created by leveraging data across the organization. Personally, I have seen all the 3 approaches actually work for us. So there is no silver bullet. So sorry if I have disappointed you all, but in the markets where we play, in one of the markets, we started with data transformation to build a single source of truth. It wasn't an easy exercise at all. Since the benefits many times were not visible at first, we started with automation of sales, operation, and finance dashboards, to then switching completely to creating backend services, which was actually utilizing, you know, some of these data infrastructure that we kept. So all our front-end experience were actually benefited from this. And then now we are leveraging that to position ourselves as a great ecosystem partner, because we are in a position to get that data from our ecosystem and enrich and kind of do upsell. In other countries, on the other hand, you know, we have followed a path of doing digitization efforts, but then undertaking data transformation, where the challenge was to rewrite some of the existing applications to start leveraging the new data sources, discovering opportunities to provide new experiences. So At present, in most of our markets, we are accelerating our efforts to move to predictive analytics, leveraging ML models, build on these data foundations. But I would say time has come for organizations to start thinking about prescriptive analytics, right? And the key point is to start sooner than later, and then have a clear roadmap, not only for your digital, but also for your data strategy.
Thank you, Abhishek. And Pedro, slightly interesting question. I think echoing what Abhishek was mentioning, especially the fifth pillar, which is people. I think there are some questions I see on the Q&A panel, which is basically on how do you handle people who are non-digital natives, or as well as legacy data. So Pedro, what's the secret formula from in your organization to actually handle that?
Well, I don't know about secret formula, but let me share some thoughts on the data transformation and the people angle. So first of all, many organizations have started this data transformation from back to front. That means organizing and making the data that is already there, but it's scattered around the organization, through multiple application systems. Many of them are decades old, let's say, right? And how do you make sense of all that data, and you transform the data into information? So that's, I think, we have seen that a lot in our industry, for instance, because many of us, our organizations have been there for quite some time, right? The second piece is around transforming this information into insights, right? And that's yet another challenge that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort by many different functions, not just the chief data officer or the CDO or for that matter, right? And I fully agree with that. And then I think the last mile, which is how do we change the customer experience, and how do we make use of this data in a way that becomes a competitive advantage, or in which way you can improve services for your customers, products, etc. Right? And that last mile normally is the last one to be done. And I'm not entirely convinced that this is the best way. I think to your point, right? I would say these things need to go hand in hand. Yes, you need to transform the data. Yes, you need to make the data available so it can be consumed by systems that then engage with the customer, right? So you need systems like content management systems, data and analytics systems, data management platforms, so you can aggregate data from external partners, personalization capabilities, A/B testing capabilities, and real-time decisioning. All of the above you need to make this work. So it is not simply enough to say that, I'm going to have all this data available. I mean, the point here is, what do you do with all this data, right? And how do you, the right word here is, how do you activate this data, right, at the customer level? So that said, I think people and talent is definitely one of the challenges that all of us have, and with more ventures and more business models and new entrants being launched in many of our markets, we see, of course, this scarcity of talent to embrace and let's say approach this whole data transformation in a very effective way, because there's a lot of movement of people between these different let's say initiatives that are out there in the market. It's a very important aspect, and let me just conclude by saying that there's a lot of moving parts in this particular space. I'm very passionate about this particular area, and there are many moving parts, and the landscape is changing. So it's not just about having the talent for what has been done before, in the past. It's having the talent for what is going to happen in the future. I think that's the key nuance that I will leave to the audience as food for thought.
Abhishek, I see your hands being raised. So.
Yeah. I just want to, for the benefit of the audience, I want to say that a BCG study predicted that 70% of the workforce, which is 20% right now, will have to be upskilled in digital in the next 5 to 10 years time. So I would just like to add to Pedro by saying that there are two important factors, skilling and empowerment, right? I think we can get the talent from outside to actually help in certain key roles, but that skilling of the entire organization and that culture change and the empowerment, more importantly, is kind of going to play an important role. And often forgotten leadership attribute is, are CEOs and CXOs open to moving towards a servant leadership model, where they actually empower the team to kind of do their stuff. And we also saw Darren spoke about use cases and teams are organized around customer journeys, but all that requires constant skilling as well as empowerment of our teams.
Thank you, Abhishek. Terry, I'd just like to hear from your perspective. We've been talking about people empowerment and making sure that people are well aligned with the digital transformation goals. How important is it from your angle? And when you see challenges, how, as a solution provider, are you working with organizations?
Yeah, and if I think about the what Darren talked about, between the front office and the back office, we focus on those pieces in the middle around, the offering, the agreement, and then optimizing your revenue operations out the back. One of the biggest pain points that we hear from customers around contract lifecycle management is, silos of information and manual processes. So getting to a point where we can influence adoption with perhaps some of the less tech savvy people, it's bringing documents to life in a digital way that are easy to interact with. For example, implementing e-signature where you can, and introducing some automation around the use of those documents internally. Because I think we talk about optimizing the customer experience. Well, we need to help the employee experience first, or certainly alongside that, so that they can optimize the customer experience. So we see one place to start, even if you don't have all your information in one place, is creating really beautiful documents that you can interact with easily and layer a workflow around that, as an example.
Thanks, Terry. And Abhishek, I'd like to start with an interesting question from the audience. And we have been talking about digitalization and digital transformation as an entire scope of projects. Now, we know that there is digitalization and digitization. How do you balance, especially when you're trying to create a model while trying to optimize whatever processes that you have?
So if I got the question right, the audience member wants to know, how do you keep the lights on, BAU, as well as push the envelope with respect to digital transformation? Yeah. I think I would say that's where some of us get paid, right? So I think, but there are principles in terms of how do you invest, the money. If you have, let's say, $100 to actually invest in your digital transformation, I would say start off by investing $30, $40 at least in the BAU digitization, improving the efficiencies, another 50 or 60% into digital transformation, because you need to keep your eyes on the ball on the medium and the long term, and another 10%, which is moonshots, right? Those are some of the tricks that you would follow. I think the key, however, apart from allocating of these budgets, is going to be, how are you going to prioritize yourself and your team's focus around these initiatives? And therefore, what you require is working and creating a shared goal atmosphere within the organization, where driving digitization or digital transformation is not only CDO or CIO's perspective, but the entire organization actually moves ahead in that direction.
Okay, that's great. Pedro, you raised your hand, so I'd like to hear from your angle as well.
Yeah, so look, I kind of share these thoughts Abhishek just mentioned. I would say more and more companies will have to think about game changers. It's just not enough to continue as we were maybe a few years back. You need a few game changers, what Abhishek referred as moonshots, right? I think we need, investing 10% perhaps on that a few years ago was okay. Right now, it's maybe not just enough, right? I think you need to perhaps double down on some of those, the so-called big bets, and see, and take a chance on, at least in some markets, see what works and what doesn't work. We certainly have done that in a few of our markets. And we believe this, let's say double strategy, attacker and defender, can yield, potentially more results or better results, let's say, in times to come, right? Because there's many things happening in our markets as we speak, right? Many new entrants, not just from banking, but from outside banking, as we all know. So there are fintech players, big tech players, tech fin players, etc. Right? So all kinds of initiatives are out there, and we need to move at pace if we want to have a chance of succeeding.
If I can just add to that, just a thought, because all of us in the CDO and the CIO space believe that our work is to launch digital transformation, the most beautiful looking technology, emerging solutions. But let's not forget, our companies have products that we sell. I think that fundamentally also needs to shift. And I would say that we need to push our teams to start thinking about solutions and not just products. And what I mean by that is a combination of the chassis, which is a base product, the experience that you create along with it with digital, as well as the services from ecosystem partners, which actually help you bundle that entire thing together. So you have to up the game to ensure that customers are willing to pay a premium for the solution and not the product. I think that is not in the space of CDO or CIOs, but I think it is time that the CDOs and CIOs started to actually get involved in that.
Thank you, Abhishek. And I think I will end with that question later on, but I want to go to Terry. Terry, we have heard from Abhishek and Pedro how people are looking at both sides, digitization and digitalization. When you work with customers, where do you recommend starting, especially with your solutions?
Yeah, what we tend to start with is a discussion around a maturity framework. And everyone wants to sort of benchmark where they are. So we look at the middle office process around offering agreements and revenue. And basically we look at whether they have a foundation. So that means, do they have at least a reasonably centralized set of data that they can start to introduce automation, document automation around, and then moving up the stack to ultimately intelligence around, for example, intelligence around the types of terms and conditions in our contracts that are taking the most cycle times, but potentially are the less profitable elements of our agreements, through to making it, how do we make it easier then for customers to reorder products, for customers to renew contracts. So it's taking the customer through that initial assessment on a maturity framework, if you like. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it might be starting with some document automation, perhaps in a product or solution area, or a subset of the sales team that is deliberately looking to be more agile and adaptive. So yeah, really taking that step back and looking at the current processes and where we might inject. Sometimes it's driven by necessity. For example, around ISO compliance? Do you have proper governance around your contract libraries? Do you have a contract library that's consistent? Can it be easily audited next year and the year after, as an example?
Thank you, Terry. And Abhishek, quick one.
No, I think I was responding to one of the questions, but it's fine. It's okay.
Okay. We are going to be ending soon, but I just want to quickly go back to that question, interesting one that you mentioned, Abhishek, and I want a quick answer. In terms of a lot of digitalization and digital transformation, especially in highly regulated industries that you guys in, especially you and Pedro, along regulatory lines, because that's how products are being designed. You mentioned about breaking down those silos and looking at it from an organizational perspective. Are regulators helping you?
So what we have been able to do is, I think I've always said this in my life, is that legal and compliance teams are my best friends, right? Because when you start to re-engineer processes and experience, you have to break certain barriers and shackles. And I'm sure Pedro would kind of feel the same. If you start off a conversation by saying that this is the way it is done and it cannot be done any other way, then you are starting with a defeat mindset any which ways. What we have been able to do is having bi-weekly checkpoint calls with our control functions involved and having a shared goal into making those digital transformation work. So we actually give an update to them and we solicit any proactive feedback from them on how we could actually do this better. If you believe that you want their involvement and certain type of processes or experiences require heavy involvement, I would say get them as part of your agile shared services team. It is important. You cannot leave it to the end to get the control functions involved. And this would be, also equivalent for finance functions or operations function or HR for that matter. So get people on board as early as possible.
Thank you. I think that's all. We have time now. Sorry about that, Pedro. I know you wanted to answer that question too, and I think we'll pick your brains later on. So thank you. Thanks to all our panelists. I think that was a really good conversation, and I think lots to talk about and think about.